back to our Stony Hill video series on adult spiritual development and our journey together from childhood primitive ego to a more awakened and enlightened adult consciousness. Today we're going to take a look at 5 of the big ideas in Chapter 2 entitled Primitive Ego Development. So we'll jump in here. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Growth is a willingness to change the way we think. Now, a lot of times people think that when we grow, we have to somehow become a whole new person. That's not true. When we're growing, what we're basically doing is changing the way we think about the world, the way we see the world, okay? In other words, we're using new maps. We're using different maps of reality. So, again, growth is a willingness to embrace change. Now, why do I bring that up here as far as primitive ego development? Because the primitive ego does not like change. That's probably one of the basic teachings that we'll encounter over and over again in the chapters in this book. The primitive ego resists change. So if you're resisting change, it's probably a good indicator, I guess is the best way to say it, that your primitive ego is probably in control. If you're open to change, in other words, you have an open mind and you're willing to look at new ideas, that's a more adult level of consciousness. Okay, second big idea in this chapter. Our goal is to change ourselves, not others. The primitive ego loves to change other people, but rarely is willing to change itself. So if we find ourselves being a little bit too rigid and kind of figuring that we know how others should be and what the world should look like, that's probably another good indicator that we're working out of our primitive ego, that ego of childhood. When we change ourselves, we do it by becoming more self-aware. In other words, we look inside. Now, when you first look inside, you're probably not going to like what you see. Most of us don't. That's why we don't bother looking inside, because we see things that we'd just as soon rather not see, okay? The moment we're willing to look at that and to go inside and see ourselves and become self-aware, that's the moment that we can change the way we think. In other words, we'll recognize that the old ways are really not helpful, and we can begin to change our map of reality. Okay? So, goal, change ourselves, not others, ever. Okay? If you want to change the world, begin right here. Okay? Not over here. And you'll recognize as we get further into the book that most people, unfortunately, are more invested in changing other people, not themselves. Okay, third big idea. If you want a really good indicator of primitive ego thinking, watch for black and white thinking. And what I mean by that is the need to always be right. The primitive ego separates the entire world into right and wrong, and of course, everybody else is wrong, and the primitive ego is right. So if you find yourself being a little bit too invested in being right, and you can kind of tell because you'll kind of put stuff out in the imperative voice of absolute truth, and we'll get to that in a second. But if you find yourself being defensive a lot and needing to be right on your ideas and your beliefs and the way you see the world, then just again, go back to self-awareness and just recognize that you're using black and white thinking. Black and white thinking breaks the world into right and wrong, good and bad, either or. But an adult consciousness begins to see the world as a whole, okay? Shades of gray, if you will. So again, what we're looking for now is how do we identify if we're working out a primitive ego? And that's a really good indicator. Changing others instead of ourselves is another one. Okay, moving right along. Faith is not absolute truth. Faith is almost always not open to change. So if you have absolute truth, in other words, if you're absolutely right, then absolute truth, what you're saying basically is that you are so right that you don't have to even think about changing, okay? Remember, truth, real truth, true truth, if you will, is always verifiable, okay? It's scientifically or empirically verifiable. We can test it and you can teach it to other people. So there's nothing wrong with faith. We all have faith in various things, and it's an important part of living. It brings hope for many, many people. The problem is when it becomes absolute truth, it's just another indicator that you're probably working out of primitive ego thinking. Again, not wrong, just immature and young. If we want to awaken, then we have to separate out faith from truth. And when truth is verifiable, it means it's open to change, okay? A good way to think about that is a scientist is always trying to disprove their ideas, because if they can disprove them, then their ideas don't represent truth, okay? So a scientist is actually trained to look for why their beliefs aren't representing reality properly, okay? It's a really good insight. Okay, next big idea. We are entering a global human culture in the 21st century. In fact, we're there. In a global human culture, we're going to run into people that have a lot different beliefs than we do. We're going to run into people who have very different values from us. They have different faiths, they have different religions, they have different cultures, they have different worldviews or maps in the way they see the world. If we're going to be working out of primitive ego, guess what? They're all going to be wrong. Our way is the right way. Our religion is the right religion. Our values are the right values. If we want to be enlightened and awakened, then we have to recognize that the global human culture has a wide diversity. And we have to be open-minded and have the ability to explore their values and their beliefs and their worldviews and the way they run their cultures and not label them as wrong. They're just different. So primitive ego will always label this stuff as wrong, okay? An adult awakened self-aware ego will always say, that's different. Never thought about it that way. Okay? So, to summarize, what we've got is we're entering the 21st century. We've got to learn to be more inclusive and embrace diversity, okay? And an awakened consciousness can do that. Primitive ego can't. Faith is not absolute truth. Faith is faith. If it's truth, it's verifiable and it's open to change. Faith, absolute truth, is not open to change. Good indicator you're running with a primitive ego thinking. Black and white, no question about it. You're caught in primitive ego thinking. And again, it's not right or wrong. Just pay attention to it. Just watch the way you're coming at the world. If it's black and white, it's probably a pretty primitive ego approach, okay? If your goal is awakening, that's a really good indicator that we need to be willing to change the way we think and the way we see the world. Change self, not others. Primitive ego does not like to change itself. It always invested in changing others. And growth is the willingness to change the way we think and the way we see. So those are the big ideas in Chapter 2. Again, I go into more detail in the book. I'll leave you with this quote because it's one of my favorite quotes. It's from Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet and mystic. And he says, "Out beyond the idea of right doing and wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there." Great way to look at the world. Okay, we'll see you down the road, and our next video we'll be taking a look at Chapter 3 in the book.